All right, so I'm going to pick up right after Shiloh. As you can see, I'm liberated to the outside house again. Um, so after Shiloh, Grant, again, he's heading south, keeps heading south, goes to a little city called Corinth because it was a railroad hub near the river, and laid siege to that little city, gaining control of that transportation center. And then also by June 6th, Memphis, Tennessee fell under Union control. So while Tennessee is an upper South state, this was still important in the scope of things because, again, you're gaining control of ground. Now, you would think that the politicians in Washington, D.C. would be thrilled with Grant, but they weren't. My little question mark, I'm being facetious down there. When I say why, well, I've told you why. Because he was using up men at a huge rate. And people are appalled because they don't know where the men are going to come from. Because they're thinking, we can't continue at this rate of going through men. We won't have enough men. Even the United States isn't going to have enough men. Okay, so let's talk about capturing New Orleans. Look at this man's name, Admiral Farragut. I've talked about him in class. He is the only Navy hero that you need to care about for the Civil War because most of the Civil War was fought on land. So April 25th, 1862, now we've been at the war for a little over a year, and Farragut captures New Orleans. This is a huge blow to the South because they need that port. They don't have anybody from overseas helping them yet. Britain hasn't come into the war yet, and honestly, they're not going to. But the South is hoping they will, and if they do, they have to be able to get goods in and out, and the port of New Orleans is important for that. But now they're not going to have New Orleans because Farragut's got control. Also, once you capture a city like that, as we learned with the Revolution, this is one of the problems the British had, is they capture a city, but then if they would take their troops out of that city to go somewhere else, they'd lose control of it. Well, obviously, the people in the United States know better than that. They capture the city, they have to leave troops there to hold it. So there is going to be troops in the city of New Orleans even after the war is over, because the troops will stay there during Reconstruction. It's going to cause bad feelings with the people who live in New Orleans and really across the South for a long time. But they do. They capture New Orleans and they leave troops behind them to occupy that city. Okay, now in the eastern states, things were not going all that well, and I will expand upon this in the later parts of the chapter. Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson were two outstanding military leaders, and they knew the land, and they were simply better military leaders than what Lincoln was working with. McClellan especially was just simply out of his league. He lost the first Battle of Bull Run, and was involved with that. He lost that. He lost the second Battle of Bull Run, lost the 7 Days Battle. Ambrose Burnside lost the Battle of Fredericksburg, and it went on from there, as you will see later on in the chapter. So things were not going well for Lincoln, and it looked bad for him. I mean, it looked bad on him, and it looked bad on them, that they were facing people with a lot less resources and people who didn't have a Navy. Of course, the Navy doesn't come into play that much, but still, the United States military here, and you can't manage to handle this problem. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about McClellan. His picture is cut off, but we talked about him in class. It's not that he doesn't have some background in the military. He does. He served in the Mexican-American War, just like a lot of the rest of the people who fight in the Civil War. He served under Winfield Scott. Okay, so he knows about Scott's Great Snake, and he respects Scott. But when he serves in the war, he's in the Corps of Engineers. Now, every fighting unit needs this. It's not that there's nothing wrong with being in the Corps of Engineers, but you're not out there setting up cannons, and you're not out there sticking bayonets into people usually. What he was doing was building bridges and helping set up camps and things like that. Not that there's anything wrong with that. You need those people too. But McClellan was not really usually out on the front lines, okay? And then when he gets done with the war in the Mexican-American War, he stays in the service to his credit. But when he goes back to West Point, he helps to translate field manuals from French into English, not exactly immersing himself into military strategy and things of that nature. So he's not exactly the kind of person you would want to put your whole army in under him. But that's what Lincoln did, because he gets the promotion to be in charge of the Army of the Potomac, which sort of means you're in charge of the whole army, because the Potomac is right there in Washington, D.C. Now, how does he get that promotion? All right. Well, I'll tell you how. It doesn't say this in the book, but I know a little bit about McClellan because I know a lot about Lincoln. Lincoln was pressured, not pressured, but Lincoln is taking the advice of people that he trusts. And people liked McClellan. He was connected socially and politically in Washington, D.C., the son of people who were connected socially and politically. And so they kept telling Lincoln what a great guy McClellan was. This is the guy you want for the job. He's awesome. He's wonderful. Look at this fine, upstanding young man. He'll be the great guy for the job. And so Lincoln appoints him. And, of course, he doesn't dismiss him immediately because that's not what you do. You give the guy a chance. And he does do a great job. He sets up an immaculate camp. He marches his guys around in parade formation, and the Washington, D.C. socialites love to watch that. But he's not doing probably the best job at commanding the men to try to defeat Lee. And here's how we see it. The Battle of Antietam is known as the bloodiest day in all of U.S. history. It's a little bit cliche, but that's how people refer to it in a lot of ways. Because really more Americans were killed in that one day than any other single day of fighting in any day of U.S. history, including the invasion at Normandy and any other day. Lee was going to try to invade Maryland, close to Washington, D.C. You can see where the little star is, for a couple purposes. First, to scare the pants out of the people in the North, to say, I can come right here. You need to just let the South alone and let us go. Also, farmers needed time to get their crops in so that, Lee's army can be fed. Most of these battles were taking place in farmers' fields, and so he's trying to give them a breathing room to get their crops in. And also to try to show the British and the French, but mostly the British, that he can strike at the North and they should come and help. All right? And he has a battle plan to confuse McClellan and his troops to do this. But he hands this battle plan over to one of his trusted aides in camp, and the aide, by accident, of course, I've talked about this in class. I don't think this was an accident at all. I think it was espionage. The aide, by accident, leaves the battle plans in a box in the camp as they pull out the next morning. And lo and behold, as McClellan's group pulls into camp and to where the rebel camp had been, and they start going through all the garbage in the camp, that the McClellan's guys happen to come across that very box that the battle plans were in. What are the odds? Because there were thousands of men there and lots of garbage. Okay, so the soldiers find the plans, and McClellan still doesn't attack. He dithers around about whether he should do this thing. This gives Lee time to regroup, because he realizes now his plans are useless, and he needs to bring his guys all back together, and the two sides take up battle. And it's a terrible, terrible fight. Now, you need to know that Antietam was a victory for the North, but narrow, a very narrow victory. And Lee begins to withdraw and go back down into Virginia, but McClellan doesn't follow him. And the reason McClellan doesn't follow him is because he has gotten so many people wounded and killed, and he's afraid he doesn't want to go further with that. So instead of following Lee down and possibly finishing him off, he turns around and goes back to Washington, D.C. So this is not good. Lincoln is furious with McClellan over this, and eventually he's going to fire him for it, because he's like, you had the main guy on the run, and you didn't follow him down. I mean, this is just something you don't do. All right. At this point in time, though, because of the victory at Antietam, Lincoln feels emboldened to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, he didn't do this immediately when he became president for a couple reasons, and they're listed here in red. You probably should know those reasons. He doesn't want to upset the border states at first because they still had slavery. And he had campaigned on telling people he was not about slavery. All right, so he doesn't want to do this right away. And the third bullet point is the most important. Lincoln does not believe that the president has the power to just sweep away something that is in the Constitution. So at first, when he becomes president, he doesn't just immediately free all the slaves because he doesn't think he has the power to do it. He is like Jefferson in that. If you remember, Jefferson didn't think he had the power to buy the Louisiana Purchase, but people persuaded him. People persuaded him by saying that it's morally wrong, Mr. President. He already felt that way. And they also told him that it's the actual root of the division between the North and the South. So even if you don't say it now, it's going to happen one way or the other. You're going to have to deal with slavery. And also, by making the fight about slavery, it would help to keep Britain and France from getting involved because they had already done away with slavery. And if they would then come and help the South, it makes them look like they are supporting slavery. And last, freeing slaves would weaken his military enemy, and he is the commander-in-chief, and he is allowed to do that under the laws of the Constitution. And so he was persuaded to do that. All right, so he says in September he's going to do this thing. He gives them fair warning, the southern states. He says, I'm going to do this thing, and it's going to free all the slaves in the states that are in rebellion, but not in the border states. Again, I told you he would do everything he could to make those states happy and stay. And again, he can't constitutionally. I mean, he's sort of let off the hook here because under the Constitution, he can't do that because those states are not in rebellion. Those states are still in the country. They're not his enemy. So he gives them time, and then he says on January 1st, that's the last of it, and then those slaves will be free. Now, in the real world, does this have any impact on those enslaved people in the South? No, because those Southerners aren't going to pay attention to him. Except that when Grant and Sherman sweep across the South, those slaves will be free. And even in the border states, people had to know that there was going to be an end to slavery. When the war was over, slavery was going to be coming to an end.